Welcome to Inside Safety, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer that explores the latest developments in workplace health and safety law and practice.
Hello and welcome to Inside Safety, a podcast for health and safety professionals, legal professionals, operational leaders, and executives, giving you some insights on the expectations of work health and safety obligations here in Australia. My name is Steve Bell. I'm the managing partner of the Employment, Industrial Relations and Safety team here at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, but my day job is helping clients out with work health and safety expectations at the front end, thinking about what good looks like and helping our organizational clients think about governance and structures and compliance. And then when things go wrong, helping our clients respond to workplace incidents, to prosecutions, to investigations, to coronial inquests, and everything might follow from that. I'm here today with two great friends and colleagues. We're doing a second session today on directors' expectations, and we're going to share some more practical, I think, insights as to the way in which we think directors in particular need to be supported to discharge their responsibilities. So I'm here with Olga from our Perth office. Hi, Olga.
Hi, great to be here. Great to have this discussion, part 2, with you.
Brilliant. And I'm here with Aaron from our Brisbane office.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Pleased to be here. Aaron Anderson. So I'm from Brisbane, also specialising in health and safety and helping our clients with both that front end and back end piece that you spoke about.
Now, without ruining the magic of television, we are recording this straight after we recorded part 1 of our series, but don't tell the audience that, Aaron. But for anyone who missed part 1, what did you talk to the team about?
It wasn't that long ago, Steve, so I think I've got that in my memory.
Good.
Part 1, we had a look at the legal framework in Queensland. I talked about a case of Walshaw, which was an important decision because it was sort of the first case in Queensland that focused on an organisation that was of a reasonable size, rather than the historical cases that have come through in Queensland over the last decade or so when these laws have been in place, where officers of very small organisations have been found guilty of failing to discharge their due diligence responsibilities. And so just as a quick wrap, in Walshaw, the court found ultimately that a managing director of an organisation was able to place reliance reasonably on a very senior person in the organisation to manage the construction of a zip line in far north Queensland. Ultimately, the reason the case was brought, the zip line failed and someone died, and the director was charged for failing to, not engage in, conversations with the operations manager and ensure there was appropriate specialist advice. And the court sort of said, hey, look, your capacity to take reasonable steps in the circumstances of that case is really about reasonable reliance on this operations manager who had the competence and skill, a construction background, and in fact had specific zipline experience. And it would not have been reasonable in any sense for the managing director to have imposed herself in the process. So other than just getting reporting, sitting back and understanding, are there problems that need to be resolved, and ensuring that resources are available to the operations manager, in that case, the managing director was acquitted of the charge.
So that gave us one bookend of the set of expectations. That's an acquittal. That's doing enough. That's compliance. And then, Olga, you told us about a case where we had the other end of the bookend where we know that's not enough anymore.
That's right. Similarly, but across the Tasman in New Zealand, there was another case involving a port organisation where the CEO was charged and found guilty of their failures in relation to their due diligence duties. And I think the comparison with the Queensland case is quite interesting because there, the reliance wasn't reasonable effectively. And I think what are the differences in those two cases that we pointed to and talked to last time was that the reason it wasn't reasonable was because the director was on notice of issues, I think, primarily. So on notice of the fact that there was this hazard in terms of the exclusion zone where the worker had been killed fatally, and aware of the fact that there was reports to be drafted and they hadn't been drafted, and aware of issues from past reports.
Yeah.
So I think there was red flags. The director had red flags and hadn't properly attended to those.
Now we are going to have a chat today about what are we telling the boards that we get the benefit, and at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, we have the privilege of dealing with large Australian employers, lots of clients, but many large Australian employers who have sophisticated board expectations, resourced company secretariats, heavily resourced health and safety teams, sophisticated legal teams. And even so, there are still challenges and questions about what compliance looks like, what support the directors need to meet their responsibilities, when do they know enough is enough. And it's interesting, as part of the conversation, I often encourage those companies and their boards and executives to have a sense of materiality on health and safety. And I think that is one of the challenges. Safety is a lot of things all the time. Risk is ever present. The question is, how do we get focus on the material risks to life and safety, and what are we doing about them? And often we use the language that I adopt from the safety profession. I steal it. Is the language of critical risk and critical controls. But there's something, just before we start talking about directors, there's something interesting happening up in your jurisdiction about that very topic, which I think is just worth sharing.
Yeah, look, Steve, there is. And I have been talking to boards about this in Queensland. It's Queensland-centric in the sense that what I'm going to talk about is some change to legislation. But look, people may be aware that, Dr. Sean Brady was engaged in Queensland to carry out an investigation and report on, a number of tragic deaths that occurred in the mining industry over a period of 20 years. And we're talking 47 deaths in the mining industry over a period of 20 years in circumstances where there's been a strong focus in the mining industry of specific legislation in Queensland, right, to manage specific risks associated with mining activities, okay? Yet we've still had 47 deaths. So Dr. Brady was brought in to investigate and sort of, look under the hood and say, why? What's going on? And it was really interesting. The report made some really sort of pointed findings. The report focused on the fact that, out of the 47, really none of those fatalities could be attributed to just human conduct. That is, it's not what happened at the end in the immediate circumstances prior to something going wrong. Dr. Brady said there's a failure at an organisational level. There's systemic failures. There's ongoing failures around supervisory activities and the adequacy of it, and continued failures around lack of training. Okay, so fundamental things, right, that we all know we need to focus on, and they're still going on, and we've had these 47 deaths. But what's quite interesting in the context, Steve, of the discussion that we're having today is, as a result of that report, the Parliament in Queensland has decided to amend the resources legislation. So not the general safety legislation that we sort of generally focus on across the country, but specific resources legislation in Queensland that applies to mining operations, to introduce a definition of a critical hazard, and then introduce obligations on duty holders within that framework in order to understand critical hazards and make sure within the safety management systems that are developed on mine site operations that there are adequate controls to make sure that those hazards are controlled on an ongoing basis day in, day out. And so what's really, really critical here is that in a specific piece of legislation now, where you have the officer duty that we're talking about, the obligation of governance and oversight of the organisation to make sure that the organisation is discharging its legal responsibilities, you now have in the definition of what's due diligence, a specific obligation on officers to understand critical hazards within the business, right, and to make sure that the business implements adequate processes and has adequate resources in order to make sure that people are kept safe from harm arising from those critical hazards. So we've got a specific statutory regime now with the terminology that we're talking about, and the terminology, Steve, that you spoke about prior to me talking about the Queensland example, that doesn't exist in the WHS Act.
No.
You don't find that terminology. But I think my view is, and we might have common ground here, everybody, that whilst the terminology exists in the resource legislation now in Queensland, does not exist generally in the WHS regime, the approach is the same. At a board level, you have a lot of tensions around how you're going to allocate your time, because you've got lots of areas where you need to focus on in terms of governance and oversight and compliance by an organisation. And so to allocate the time that you've got around looking at safety metrics, looking at safety indicators, and looking at what might go wrong in your business, it's following what the Queensland model is doing now around an understanding of critical hazard and control. So I think it's a really important lesson for us.
I mean, can you imagine a board that gets a investigation report that says, well, we think it was just operator error. We just think someone made a mistake. These sorts of analyses now longitudinal over a couple of decades and over, nearly 50 losses of life are saying that's not good enough. There's a broader question. There's a systems question that needs asking. And I think that's what the director's duty and the officer's duty is driving at. What is the systems analysis that you can undertake? Not expecting directors to be technicians, but expecting them to be experts in governance, which is, really important. Olga, I'm interested, we speak to board. We probably all have different ways of kind of conveying these ideas. I was just interested, you were sharing before this, your language of pillars and how that might, support directors think about their responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, as you sort of alluded to, boards are often not experts in safety, but they're required to engage with the issue proactively. So there's a lot of similar concepts when organisation engages an expert as well, I think. They are also looking to the expert to control the risks that arise out of the tasks of that particular expert contractor, but they also need to proactively check that the contractor is competent. And similarly, when a director is looking at their safety processes, they need to check that there's adequate safety professionals within the organisations. Do you have site-based roles? Do you have just head office roles? How are you going to structure your workforce? How are you going to monitor? Are you going down to the actual workshop and having discussions with people? And I think some of those discussions are, around the critical risks. So when I speak to boards, I talk about 3 pillars. So the first is the diligence part, which I talk about in terms of asking questions of the safety professionals, asking questions of those on the floor, asking questions of management, and making sure that those questions are proactive. You're applying an inquiring mind, and you're actually not stopping at the first answer. You're asking further questions when you get that answer until you really are assured that things are in hand, or that there's something in train if there is an issue, and being aware of those red flags, those gaps, looking for those gaps. The second pillar is around the governance. So what's the structure? What's the architecture, the framework of how the organisation's actually going to respond? So that's the incident framework, that's the policies and procedures, that is in part the resources. And then the last part is around reporting and transparency. And this is something that I think applies across all different areas, not just safety. It also applies across any really any ESG sort of issues. That's this ESG governance issue. So with terms of transparency, often there's reporting externally to regulators, but there might even be reporting externally, such as in relation to gender issues, to to various reporting obligations that arise. So that's why boards are, set the strategy across the organisation for all different issues. Safety is just one piece. And so applying this sort of framework, you can say, okay, what are the questions I need to ask? What's the governance? What's the piece around transparency? What reporting do I get up into the board? What reporting do we need to do externally? And how are we going to talk about what we're doing? That's the safety culture piece. How do we tell the world that we've got a good safety culture? How do we tell our people that we've got a good safety culture? That's how I see
That's
it.
great. No, I love it. And it's sort of underpinned, isn't it, by the sense of kind of chronic unease, that there's an expectation that we're not quite ever going to meet compliance. And that is so different, I think, to most areas of legislative expectations. Most of the time, when you've complied with the law. That otherwise, why have a legal requirement? But that's sort of the idea of continuous improvement, the idea of continual testing, the idea of continual investment in health and safety means that you'll actually never hit a point where you've complied with health and safety obligations. I'm interested, Aaron, what are you saying when you deal with workplace investigations about the expectations that a regulator might have of how a director has dealt with that particular issue or that particular set of circumstances?
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. And like you, we've been around for a few decades now. The dial's really shifted quite significantly lately.
Yeah.
For a long period of time, sort of incidents would occur and regulators would get in, and there'd be a stock standard model of investigation that would focus on the here and now, and it would be looking at really the organisational failures and breach at that level. And that was sort of pretty easy to deal with from a legal perspective, to be frank with you.
Yeah.
Now what we've got is a level of sophistication we haven't seen, and a level of thinking we haven't seen from regulators and inspectors. And I think this was always going to come. We're seeing inspectors now thinking and regulators thinking now a little bit more about, when I draft a notice and I've got a power to ask specific questions for people to answer them, what am I inquiring about and what's the nature of my questions? And so what that means is we're now seeing regulators issuing notices under safety regimes which are actually using the word director in the notice and asking for disclosure of materials and answers to questions which are targeted specifically in relation to what is it that you as a director or officer have done in the aftermath of an incident to understand what's gone wrong, to receive reporting in relation to it, to maintain some oversight, and then what have you done to direct and guide the organisation about the corrective actions and ensuring that the business won't engage in a similar act again.
Yeah.
So
it's quite pointed. If you're a director of an organisation that's had an incident, putting aside the significance of that and the need to improve, and it's quite pointed now, it seems to me, the sorts of questions that the regulators are asking of directors. And it is increasingly sophisticated insofar as they're using those powers to try and ask the question, should we have more prosecutions of directors? Is there an opportunity to prosecute both the company and its director? I must say there's an element to perhaps naivety. I find that there's a lack of clarity about what the role of a board is compared to the role of an executive team, compared to the role of the site manager, compared to the role of the worker. There's this sort of assumption, I think, that everyone can do the same thing, or that there's the same level of capacity to make those changes. And I worry about that because I think that we've got a challenge if we're selling directors that they're as accountable in an operational sense as an executive is as accountable in an operational sense for execution. We're really muddying the waters between what is governance, in my mind, and what is delivery. And this is a challenge. I do see these sorts of notices that would say things like, how often have the directors dealt with the management team on the ground at the workplace in relation to this issue? I had a notice last year, have the directors been through a CPD process for education about technical health and safety expectations? And everyone sort of took one step backward and got that and said, well, that is a million miles away from the lived reality of larger corporate experience. So there's some tension, I think, in the system between how things tend to operate well in organisations that are being run well, and then perhaps the starting point of what the assumption is of how that should work in health and safety. And the two don't always marry up. I don't know if you've found that.
Yeah, Steve, well, a question for you. I mean, you've dealt with lots of these notices and we've spoken about this over the time. Do you think that the regulators are really struggling to focus on, the nature of the duty that sits with each and every individual officer? You talked about a notice asking what have directors done in the plural?
Yeah.
Are you seeing notices, sort of really issued to individual directors who have a specific role? They're looking at what they're, really why they're on a board for an organisation.
I don't. No, in truth. And maybe that's a more sophisticated evolution of how we might think about these things. And we spoke in our first podcast about the importance of thinking about what are reasonable steps for me in my actual personal capacity. And I think one of the challenges is by incorporating the corporations law definition of officer into health and safety law, it's kind of confusing as to who's an officer and who's not. And we've done plenty of tasks, no doubt. They're trying to pick who's an officer and who's not in the company. And there's a level of grey associated with the middle tier. The board definitely is. The CEO and the COO definitely are. And then you get to the EGMs and it's a bit obscure. And so I think from a regulator's point of view, it's just easy to say, well, I'll forget the ambiguity. I'll just ask questions of directors. But what it means is, and this is what's so special, I suppose, about the New Zealand case, we're sort of losing a bit of attention on those who are really driving systems and systems change. No, do you feel that as well? I guess the WA market is now sort of embracing these laws. But have you seen that pattern across other regulators? Is that something that you've come across?
I think we are. And in particular, the Fair Work Ombudsman is also issuing notices to produce wanting to know who knew about what when, including directors. And I think there is those inquiries are going all the way up to the board. And I think directors need to be alive to the fact that often there's trends across regulators.
Yeah.
Regulators across the board are challenging privilege when it comes to these issues in terms of what the board knew as well. They're seeking to go behind privileged advices and reports to the board. And they're also asking these questions. So regardless of the area that the board is focusing on at any one time, they need to be alive to these risks, I think. But I think you're right. It's a question of fact of each individual director, and each individual director needs to have a think about what is their position within the company. Are they a non-executive director? Are they an executive director? Are they very, closer down in terms of their operational management? What is their knowledge? What knowledge do they need to acquire? How are they going to verify? What steps will they take? Because they only need to take reasonable steps.
I think that's really well put. I suppose the message from all of that is post-incident for organisations that are thinking about the way in which we're reporting matters, the way in which we're reporting improvements or systems changes, etc. There's a sophistication which I think is necessary to get ahead of the way in which questions might be asked of regulators. And that I think is a change. And it might even be that how an organisation has typically thought about these things in its usual governance structures probably needs to be a bit ahead of the game and thinking, well, what questions might we get asked by a regulator in relation to this incident? And all of this is about making sure that those who are properly invested in health and safety improvement have the material which proves it, which can successfully defend them in relation to any investigations or allegations that might be made against them. Do you have any other observations of director life in health and safety, or ways in which you've supported clients and organisations think about how to meet these obligations?
Yeah, I do, Steve. Look, thanks. So practically, I think one of the things that's really, really important for an officer, whether you're a director, whether you're an executive level, is to have real clear visibility over the governance structure that you're working within the organisation. And, particularly if you're a new director. So I've seen over the years, organisations developing, and updating their, director induction packs and their officer induction packs, and developing documents that we've all assisted organisations with and boards with, and that is, WHS governance frameworks, which provide clarity to a director, clarity to an executive team as to what the governance structure is, what are the committees within the organisation, how do those committees function, what are the terms of them, do they have any decision-making capability at all, how does someone become a member of that committee, how does the safety management system itself support compliance by officers with their due diligence obligations, what are the key things that will happen in response to an incident, and even, having practical checklists in these sorts of documents around, all right, officers, we can't tell you what to do, it's your duty. But, having regard to the things we just spoke about understanding and having clarity over the governance framework, understanding the systems that support compliance for everyone in the organisation, including those at a board level. What are the sort of things that, I can just turn my mind to periodically to satisfy myself that, yep, I've done the things that I think will satisfy, the legal standard of exercising due diligence. So it's a really good practical tool. I think all organisations should think about putting something in place and crystallising it.
Yeah.
So Steve, that's something that we've all done a lot of work
Yeah.
on with organisations.
I think it's well put. I feel if an organisation says to an external advisor, one of us, can you review our board report and tell us whether that's adequate to support the directors? I think that's inadequate. I think that is such a small sliver of what health and safety governance needs to be. And as you've described, it's about, are the right decisions being made by the right people, and do they have the resources to execute on it? And is it working? Do we think we're doing enough? Now, the answer to that question won't be found in a board report per se. That'll be part of the story that ideally gives some insight into strategy and execution and delivery against strategy. It'll no doubt have a load of statistics, which, we might have views on the relevance or veracity of those, but nevertheless, that's a part of traditional board reporting. But that's not the answer. The real answer is how do I, as a director, talk about my role and what I am doing in, as you said, the architecture of the entirety of health and safety governance. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but on occasion you might ask a client, well, can you just describe to me how this works, how these subcommittees interact with each other, what the interplays are, what the decision-making, and it can happen that they can't, that we have to rush around to 6 different sources. We don't have a single consolidated story to tell about what governance looks like. And so for me, I think that's a crystal clear recommendation. Any other thoughts from you, Olga?
I think that a lot of directors and officers are feeling quite overwhelmed
Yeah.
by the sheer volume of regulatory change and the pace of change, as well as the increased, I guess, responsibilities that are being thrown at them by various pieces of legislation.
Yeah.
And it's coming from all different sources. So I think there's a lot to get across, and I think it's important to stay on top of all of that, and I guess part of the governance is also ensuring that you've got the teams that you need in the organisation to be able to meet those obligations.
Yeah. It is a challenging time, it feels, of a reflex position that every time a corporate duty is introduced, we layer up with a director's duty or an officer's duty. We often criminalise that. And there is something happening in the economy where I think there's a challenge to whether that's the right model or whether that's appropriate. This is not to say people should be let off scot-free for negligence or turning a blind eye or not being involved in things that impact people's life and well-being. But have we got the balance right? I think these are live questions in the economy. If I was to wrap up, my recommendations, I think from there's great conversations that we've had today. I think organisations need to support their senior leaders with clarity on the sorts of issues we're talking about. That's the stuff of training, I suppose, or of more consultative engagement about whether what they're getting is enough to support them in meeting their personal responsibility. I do think organisations need to reflect on the way in which they're creating documentary evidence that shows the engagement of senior leaders following serious incidents or following serious near misses in a way which is probably more sophisticated now than it has been in the past. I think that was the point you made, Aaron. It is changing, and it's changed quite quickly. And there's a need, I think, for some of that planning about how we're going to report, how we're going to manage legal privilege, how we're going to learn from this incident, how we're going to improve. The sort of governance structures that you've both spoken about, I think, are essential and are a key ask of you, if you're a director watching this podcast now, of your management team. What is my fallback position if I need to prove about my role sitting in the architecture of overall health and safety governance? What's the artifact on which I'll rely to do that? And if it involves going to 12 other documents and trying to piece something together in a rush, that's a warning sign for me. That's a red flag. And I think the final point I would make, which goes back to your very initial point, Aaron, the key issue of criticality. What are the material hazards and risks in the organisation? What are the things which are fatal or catastrophic risks in the organisation? What are our critical controls? I think it's really critical that boards don't lose sight of that. Now, in other podcasts and in other contexts, we're introducing all sorts of discussions about other things which can be harmful at work, psychosocial risks, the way we should deal with each other, harassment at work, etc. All those things remain important in their place, but it's important we don't let them overwhelm or over-index the impact on material physical risks in the workplace, and getting that balance right for the health and safety professionals and the legal and the operational professionals listening in. I'd really encourage you not to lose sight of that, because I think it's easy to do amidst all the noise. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening to Inside Safety. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Olga. We've really enjoyed bringing you this podcast. There's plenty more to come over the course of this year. If you are listening and you've enjoyed the podcast, please follow on whatever service you're listening to this streaming service on. Otherwise, we look forward to welcoming you back to the next Inside Safety Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer podcast. Thanks for listening.